morning, everybody. The hearing of the Senate Judiciary Committee will come to order. And before we begin, I would like to go over the committee's rules regarding our hearings. Today's hearing deals with a serious issue, and I know that members of the public will act accordingly. And I want to note at the outset that the rules of the Senate prohibit outbursts, clapping, or demonstrations of any kind. This includes blocking the view of people around you. So please be mindful of these rules. And I know this isn't going to be necessary, but if such events occur, then the person will be asked to leave. I'm glad to be joined by my colleagues, Senator Brian Schatz and Congresswoman Colleen Hanabusa at this hearing. I'd like to start with a opening statement, and I'll ask my colleagues if they'd also like to present opening statements before we take our first panel. Thank you. 20 years ago, on September 13, 1994, the Violence Against Women Act, better known as VAWA, was signed into law. And VAWA represented a major shift in the way Congress approached the issue of domestic violence. With its enactment, Congress acknowledged a federal role in recognizing that domestic violence is not a private matter to be kept among family and suffered in silence. It's a crime and should be treated as such. VAWA recognized that domestic violence is a complicated, multifaceted crime that defy easy solutions. The root causes of domestic violence are varied. It could include stressors such as age, a history of family violence, and a large number of social-economic factors. To address this fact, VAWA looked to prevent domestic violence and related crimes by encouraging collaboration among law enforcement, the judiciary, and both public and private sector service providers. As part of our ongoing commitment to ending domestic violence, Congress has reauthorized VAWA 3 times since 1994. I have supported domestic violence legislation since first taking elected office more than 30 years ago, and am proud that one of the first major bills that I co-sponsored and worked on as a senator was the 2013 VAWA reauthorization. I co-sponsored that bill, which focused on expanding VAWA protection and services to better serve Indian country, the LGBT community, and protecting women regardless of immigration status. After 20 years, therefore, more people are able to seek VAWA's protections, and more services are available to meet the needs of distinct communities and populations than when first enacted. But work remains. Every year, on the anniversary of VAWA's passage, the National Network to End Domestic Violence conducts a count of adults and children served by domestic service providers all across the country. As a snapshot, on September 17, 2013, nearly 70,000 people, including 575 from Hawaii, sought such services. Still, while service providers helped nearly 70,000 people that day, there were still nearly 10,000 men and women who sought services whose needs were not met. There are also populations that VAWA does not cover. One community that has been largely removed from the VAWA conversation is the military, our active duty personnel and their families. That does not mean that military men and women go unserved. In fact, for many years, the Department of Defense's Family Advocacy Program, or FAP, and other support services have provided military victims with assistance. These programs work with perpetrators and their military command to prevent domestic violence and enforce appropriate consequences. We know that the military population faces different challenges than the population at large. Females who are between 20 and 24 years of age are at the greatest risk of non-fatal intimate partner violence. In 2012, nearly 1/2 of active duty personnel, military personnel, were under the age of 25. And while this should not be taken to indicate higher instances of domestic violence in the military, the age factor is worth noting. There are also emotional and psychological stressors that military and their families experience that are not shared by the rest of us. Deployments, for example, present a specific type of long-term absence from home. The transition back to civilian life after deployment is also challenging, particularly for those who have been in combat. These are just two possible contributing factors to potential domestic violence in the military. And what we do know is that military-connected men and women do seek non-military provider services. During a 2-week period in September of 2014, the Domestic Violence Action Center, DVAC, worked with 40 active duty personnel or intimate partners of active duty personnel who sought help. That is 4 people a day over a 10-day period. Active duty military and their families are part of our community, and they should be able to seek services when and where they feel most comfortable. Attorney General Louis has noted in his written testimony that VAWA stakeholders have identified 3 priority areas for collaboration of services. And the first 2 appropriately are providing enhanced training for first responders and improving outreach to underserved populations. The third issue identified is addressing the need for services sought by military-connected men and women. To this end, I anticipate expanding upon the Attorney General's VAWA Military Working Group's efforts. The main question we want to answer today is not why military men and women are seeking services off base. Rather, we're focusing on how best to address the needs of these men and women. Given the current federal budget constraints, we must examine how existing Department of Defense and VAWA resources can be used to ensure quality services for our service members and their families. Now, how can we ensure that there is a continuum of care, a safety net for men and women involved in abusive relationships, regardless of where an abusive incident occurs, when it happens, or who employs those affected? As we gain a better understanding of the unique stressors that impact military personnel, how can we fit their specific needs into the program directives of VAWA? I believe the answer is through collaboration, which VAWA envisioned since it was first enacted. Collaboration among state and local governments, service providers, and the Department of Defense. It will take a community-wide effort for us to eliminate this community-wide problem. Today's hearing is an opportunity to hear from the various stakeholders on strengthening the collaboration between civilian and military service providers, to see where there is overlap and learn where collaboration can be fostered and improved upon. As a member of both the Senate, Armed Services, and Judiciary committees, I look forward to working with appropriate stakeholders to ensure that we do the best we can in both the military and civilian sectors to meet the needs, particularly today, of military-connected victims of domestic violence. We have 2 panels this morning, and I look forward to hearing from you. And now, Senator Schatz and Congresswoman Hanabusa, if you'd like to provide opening statements, please do so.
Thank you, Senator Hirono. And I want to thank you for organizing a field hearing on such an important issue. Domestic violence is tragic, and the damage it causes doesn't end with the victim. Violence hurts our families, our children, and communities. We've made progress in preventing domestic violence and supporting victims. Since the passage of VAWA in 1994, there has been a drop in domestic violence incidents by over 50%. Last year, President Obama made history when he signed into law a stronger VAWA bill. And I'm proud to say that all members of Hawaii's congressional delegation were co-sponsors of this legislation. The new law will help bring survivors of domestic violence out of the shadows to receive life-saving services. But there is more to do. The National Network to End Domestic Violence puts out an annual snapshot of how many victims are seeking help in each state in a 24-hour period. Hawaii's most recent snapshot was sobering. In one day, over 500 domestic violence victims were served in Hawaii, and domestic violence hotlines received over 100 calls from victims. That's more than 5 calls an hour. The focus of this hearing is on the support available to military-connected families that experience domestic violence. Domestic violence in military families is such a critical issue because it is a problem that seems to be getting worse. Even as incidents of domestic violence are going down across the country, domestic violence in military and veteran communities appears to be going up. The military provides many resources for victims of domestic violence, but there are challenges to addressing domestic violence in military families. Military families often live far from their friends and families, which makes them particularly socially isolated. They live with enormous stress from deployment, both while the service member is away and when they return. Victims also face a terrible choice in reporting domestic violence to the military. A report could mean risking the service member's career and the whole family's financial stability. For this reason, many victims feel more comfortable seeking support from community-based organizations. There is clearly a role for both military support services and community-based support. But we need to ask whether military support services are adequately addressing the needs of victims. And we also need to look at whether VAWA's funding takes into account the reality that community-based organizations are part of the front line for military families experiencing domestic violence. I hope that this is the beginning of a dialogue between the Department of Defense and community-based domestic violence organizations about creating a collaborative and coordinated approach to preventing domestic violence in military families and supporting victims. Thank you.
Thank you. Congresswoman Hanabusa.
Thank you. Aloha and good morning.
Aloha.
And I want to begin by, of course, thanking Senator Hirono for convening this field hearing, and also to Senator Schatz and all the panelists, distinguished guests, and to everyone who made time to join us today. Domestic violence touches every corner of our community. It does not depend on race or income. It affects men, women, gay, straight, and while it was recently been the subject of talk about sports figures and police officers, we cannot let that distract us from the fact that it reaches across the spectrum of social and professional relations. We are here today to address how VAWA serves Hawaii's military families and basically how we are going to address the domestic violence. Now, before we begin that, we do have to kind of understand how VAWA came about, and Senator Hirono gave us the rundown, which is that it was in 1994. Actually, Vice President Biden is the one credited for the passage of the original VAWA, and it expired in the year 2011. It did not get reauthorized until just recently in 2013. It was a very interesting vote. Though Senator Hirono left us in the House and went to the Senate, she clearly understands the difficulty of a piece of legislation like this getting through the House of Representatives. It passed the Senate 78-22, and it passed the House 286 to 136. Now, what you need to, 138, what you need to understand is of that, 87 Republicans joined the solid Democrats in passing VAWA in the House. What it meant was the importance of that issue, because the 87 Republicans in the House, for that to come to the floor, violated what they call their Hastert rule, which meant the majority of the majority had to be in favor of a piece of legislation before it could be actually voted on. But the concepts and those issues that were contained in VAWA mobilized a portion of the Republican coalition that said this was too important, we had to do it. And that's how VAWA became law. And it did have major components, and one that helped build those coalitions. For example, the tribal aspects of it, gay and lesbians and immigrations, all as mentioned by Senator Hirono. But what it did was it managed to force the building of that coalition. And that's how we have VAWA today. We also must understand what it means in terms of what the purpose of it is. It is legal assistance, transitional housing, counseling support, advocacy. And what it is credited with some statistics that have been used, is that since its inception and about 15 years later, it reduced violence about 58% in 15 years. And I think they were measuring it primarily by rape. But there was some transition that was done in that. But sadly, domestic violence affects our military families, which is the subject of today's hearing. And whether the victim of abuse is a member of the armed services or a family member, we owe it to her or him, and let there be no question that VAWA applies to both men and women, though we do call it Violence Against Women's Act. Because domestic violence knows no boundaries, it applies. And we need to help to provide a safe home. And we owe it to the abuser to also discover how do we break this cycle of violence. The most important first step is for us to bring the question out of the shadows by shining the light on the problem and acknowledging that it affects Hawaii's military families, and we need to speak open and have a productive discussion about what we can do and must do. And that is why, as I look across from me and I see Nancy Creedman, I know of no one who probably knows this issue as well as she does as to the Hawaii community. And she can probably give us what I consider to be the hidden facts about Hawaii's military. Because Hawaii's military has always represented a special culture of their own. And I think that's probably been the reason why we have had such a difficulty in understanding and getting our hands on this particular issue. We're hoping that what these hearings will do is to bring this matter out and make it so that people can seek the help and the assistance that we need. So we must make it a priority that the health and safety of Hawaii's military's family is paramount, and I do look forward to participating in this conversation. Again, I thank Senator Hirono.
Thank you very much, Senator Schatz and Congresswoman Hanabusa. I'd like to now ask our first panel of witnesses to step forward and be seated. I'd like to briefly introduce our first panel of witnesses. Colonel Derek Arinko-Ryan. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Yes, ma'am.
And Ms. Cindy Morita are here on behalf of U.S. Army Hawaii to share with us information about the services available to men and women connected with the military who are experiencing domestic violence. Colonel Arinko-Ryan is a published researcher who serves as the Deputy Director of the Army's Behavioral Health Unit in Hawaii. He has served with the Army for 28 years and has a doctorate in clinical social work. His colleague, Ms. Morita, serves as U.S. Army Hawaii's Family Advocacy Program Manager. She has a master's degree in social work and has worked on domestic violence issues in various states for a number of years. I look forward to hearing from both of you. Ms. Dawn Ogden, the Counseling and Advocacy Program Supervisor at Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam, which provides services for Navy and Air Force personnel and their families, has a master's degree in social work and has worked to provide clinical services in both the civilian and military sectors for a number of years. Ms. Ogden has been with Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam's program supervisor, been supervisor since 2010. I'd also like to take this time to acknowledge our military partners in the audience today, including Captain Neferet. Raise your hand if you're here. There you are. Thank you so much for joining us, representing Pacific Fleet. Teresa Phillips, representing Navy Region Hawaii, and the staff representing Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam. I think there are a number of staff people here. Thank you. Additionally, the commander of the Schofield Health Clinic, Colonel Eberhardt, is here, and staff representing Army Garrison Hawaii. Thank you all for being here. The Honorable David Louie has served as Hawaii's Attorney General since 2011. In that capacity, he oversees 175 deputy attorneys. I used to be one myself way back when. And provides legal counsel for the governor, legislature, and various state agencies. Among other things, the Attorney General's office receives the vast majority of federal funding through the VAWA Act, and will share with us how VAWA funds have been allocated. And before we hear from this panel, though, I do need to swear you in, so please rise and raise your hand. Do you affirm that the testimony you are about to give before the committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God.
I do.
Thank you. Please be seated. So we are going to start with Colonel.
Ma'am, we have decided that one person from the Army will
Oh.
introduce our statement.
Go ahead, Ms. Morita.
Thank you. We would like to start off by extending a warm aloha and thank you to Senator Hirono, Senator Schatz, and Representative Hanabusa for this opportunity to speak at the Senate Judiciary hearing regarding Army Family Advocacy Program, which I'll refer to as FAP. FAP is the Department of Defense Social Services Program whose mission is to help address child abuse, child neglect, and domestic abuse affecting our military families. We provide primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention services and clinical interventions. The Army's Hawaii footprint consists of approximately 15,000 married active duty soldiers with an average of 46% living on posts and 54% living off posts. The United States Army FAP here in Hawaii is comprised of the following programs. FAP Behavioral Health provides assessment, treatment, clinical interventions at Tripler Army Medical Center and the Schofield Barracks Health Clinic. And Army Community Service FAP Prevention provides education support services, including New Parent Support Program and Victim Advocacy Program. One of our goals is to ensure for every incident of domestic violence and child abuse, the families receive timely and appropriate care. Army Hawaii FAP has a surveillance initiative for families reporting verbal disputes to the military police. This initiative allows victim advocates and social workers to reach out early to potential victims of domestic violence. The reporting process often involves multiple processes which are triggered after a domestic violence incident is reported. FAP, Child Welfare Service, law enforcement, and commanders may all be engaged and provide coordinated services. Commanders are mandated to report all child abuse and domestic abuse to the military police, who are then required to notify FAP for coordination and case management. FAP ensures victims have access to military and civilian resources that provide support and safety. Throughout the process, a victim advocate is available to assist victims with making a report, crucial safety planning, providing information on legal rights and reporting options, and leading victim support groups. VAs can also attend court hearings and law enforcement interviews. Our dedicated victim advocates provide 24 hours, 7 days a week responses and safety planning services. FAP Behavioral Health provides individuals, counseling, couples and family counseling, domestic violence intervention, parenting support, and healthy relationship groups. FAP also offers ongoing mandatory critical training for commanders, troops, professional, and community members that addresses safety education, spouse and intimate partner abuse prevention, and family life education. We also offer numerous prevention activities and support, including New Parent Support Program, home visits, and skills building classes. We maintain relationships with the external community to help coordinate reporting and synchronize efforts. The United States Army Hawaii FAP, also along with our sister service leadership, has prioritized collaboration with each other and with our civilian partners through the Military Family Advocacy Coordinating Council, comprised of military and civilian agencies designed to facilitate the opportunity to network and increase communication, share processes, identify challenges, and provide information and updates. One of the successful outcomes through this partnership included an agreement to provide restraining order notification between family courts and military services. The notification agreement increased our visibility on restraining orders and allowed us to reach out to victims in a timely manner. We know the sooner we can intervene, the better we can provide safety options for victims of domestic violence. We hope we were able to provide you an overview of the United States Army Hawaii FAP program. We would like to again thank you for the opportunity to share with you our process and also to extend our appreciation to Congress for its continued support of family advocacy program that allows us to work with our military families and meet their needs. Thank you.
Thank you. I apologize for my coughing, but I have a cold. I don't think I'm giving anybody my germs now. I don't think I'm contagious at the moment, so please, go ahead, Ms. Ogden. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, Senator Hirono, Senator Schatz, and Congresswoman Hanabusa. Thank you for the opportunity to address you today. My name is Dawn Ogden. I'm a clinical social worker with the Department of Navy for almost 18 years. I'm honored to share information about the domestic violence services and programs provided at Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam. I have worked with the Family Advocacy Program since starting with the Navy in government service in 1996. I have seen the commitment the Navy has to ending domestic violence as a clinician working directly with victims, offenders, and their children for my first 14 years, and now as a supervisor for 22 staff members employed by Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam as part of their family violence prevention and intervention programs. The services we provide to active duty Navy and Air Force members and their families. In addition, we serve commands, first responders such as military, medical, and law enforcement, and other military partners like child and youth programs and military mental health. We also collaborate and coordinate services with community organizations and institutions such as Child Welfare Services, Domestic Violence Action Center, Honolulu Police Department, Women, Infant, Children, and many of our local schools with a high number of military dependents, to name just a few. We believe a coordinated community response is vital to effectively responding to domestic violence, and we are committed to enhancing opportunities for collaboration and building relationships. Again, thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to being of service in today's hearing.
Thank you. Attorney General?
Thank you, Senator Hirono, and let me thank the committee for convening this hearing. My thanks to you personally, Senator Hirono, and also to Senator Schatz, and also to Congresswoman Hanabusa for your leadership on this issue. It's of vital importance to both our state and our community here, as well as to the nation. I have submitted written testimony, and I'm not going to read it all to you. I know you'll be pleased at that. Let me just hit a couple of the highlights that I would like to note for this hearing. First off, I mean, obviously there is a domestic violence issue and problem here in Hawaii. My office tracks statistics on these matters through our Hawaii Criminal Justice Division. In 2013, there were 4,959 domestic violence related arrests. Those are just arrests. This is a 13% increase over the last 5 years. In 2013, there were 8,750 victims that received assistance. This was a 16% decrease, which I think, you never really know, but I think it reflects decreases in funding. It may reflect decreases in reporting and just changes in the way things happen. It's a problem. We all know it's a problem, and I am very pleased that you're spotlighting and convening this so that we can address the problem that the military shares with our community. This is not a military problem, it's not a Hawaii problem, it's a problem for all of us, and it crosses all lines, as Congresswoman Hanabusa noted. We have been so very fortunate, and I thank you folks for your roles in getting VAWA passed again. And I thank you so much. We have been in the forefront of helping to administer those grants here in Hawaii. We get about $1 million a year. And so every year we have convened a group of 14 representatives, including law enforcement, domestic violence, sexual assault, community providers, prosecuting attorneys, police chiefs, family court judge, etc., to come together and figure out how are we going to distribute this money in the best way possible, given that it's limited funds. And so we do that every year. And in general, we give 5% to the judiciary, 25% to the police, 25% to prosecutors, and 30% to victim services. There's also a 15% discretionary amount, and we have always allocated that to victim services. So we give 45% of the grant to victim services, believing that that is a very important area to go through. Now, what does my office do in this area? Obviously, I'm the Chief Law Enforcement Officer of the state of Hawaii, but primarily criminal matters and matters of domestic violence, sexual assault, and things like that, we rely upon the Honolulu prosecutors and the prosecutors of all the counties, because basically all of that authority to prosecute those matters is delegated out to the various counties. But in addition to helping to distribute the VAWA grants, about 2 years ago, Senator Schatz called me into his office, and we had a meeting with, I think, Nancy Kriegman and others. There were others, community providers, and what was raised was the lack, essentially, of a coordinated community response. That there was not always good communication between the first responders, who many times would roll over. As they got promoted, you'd help to train them, but as they got promoted, then there wasn't always the training for the next person coming into the position. People changed positions, so relationships did not always get built. And so we looked at that and we thought, well, let's convene a group, since we already have the VAWA State Planning Committee. I put it to the Planning Committee, since we were already addressing domestic violence issues. Would they like to participate in a working group to address this coordinated community response? And the central question, which was posed by both Abraham Lincoln and Bill Bradley in his most recent book, how can we all do better? Okay, and so I was very pleased that the response was overwhelmingly positive by this group. We got together. It has been my great privilege and pleasure to serve in a capacity as convening this group. Over the last year, we've met 6 times. Law enforcement has come, the judiciary has come, the victim service providers have come, prosecutors, police, and it's really been a great conversation, because one of the things is that by getting together and talking about these things and trying to identify issues and where do we have opportunities to collaborate, communicate, and cooperate, we were able to forge relationships, and people were able to pick up the phone and talk to their counterparts. And that is such a huge thing that I look forward to you folks and to our community and to the military to try and work in a collaborative fashion. Just the mere fact of getting together in this room alone and in the meetings that we had really helped to focus what people's, not only their issues, but their challenges. Because it's one thing for somebody to say, oh, you're not doing your job, or you need to do a better job, but when you appreciate the fact that everybody's working under limited resources and that everybody wants to do a better job, we can figure out how to collaborate and not duplicate services. So I really appreciate the opportunity to work with all of the people on our planning group. We focused, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, Senator, that we picked 3 areas, and the first one was training for first responders, outreach to underserved communities, and then addressing the growing need for services for the military. That last piece is one that we have just started to promote and to work on. We have convened a subgroup to address that, and we were in the process of starting to figure out how we were going to reach out to the military. So this is very convenient for us that you can foster.
Great minds think alike.
There we go. And so I look forward to that conversation, and I think it's very important to have that conversation at multiple levels. That is, if only the staff are talking and only the line workers are talking, it's not enough. If only the top leaders are talking, that's not enough. We have to have engagement and discussion and continued discussion at all levels so that we can have this coordinated response and move forward together. So I look forward to working with you folks on this, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Attorney General. And before we proceed to probably 5-minute rounds of questions so that we'll be able to possibly have multiple opportunities to ask questions. I would like to acknowledge the presence of Flo Nakakuni, our U.S. Attorney. There she is. Thank you so much for being here. Okay, I will start the first round of questions. Attorney General, you mentioned that in the 3 areas that you identified as need areas on this issue, that the one that we're focusing on today, of course, is collaborating with the military. And by the way, the password, maybe the byword really is coordinated community response. I think you'll hear that a lot. That was, I believe, in the first VAWA, and it is all about bringing the stakeholders together. So in your efforts, though, you said that you would like to have outreach to the military, so that means that you don't have a military representative or representatives on your working group at present.
That is correct.
Now, Ms. Morita, I think it would be very helpful for us to really understand the context in which domestic violence occurs. And so you've got experience in both the private sector and the military side working with these families. And can you share with us some of the common factors surrounding domestic violence?
Or specifically for military?
Well, for both, because the common factors that overlay. And then we'll get to some of the stressors, particular stressors that military families face.
So when we think about domestic violence, as the opening statements indicated, there are lots of different issues that impact military and civilian domestic violence victims.
Ms. Morita, could you speak
Sure.
into the mic?
As the opening statements indicated, we talked about how domestic violence crosses all barriers, and so when we look at domestic violence, some of the issues that we see are around finances, complex issues on mental health, all sorts of different issues. What we do see in the military is that our clients look very similar to domestic violence in all situations.
Are there not some very specific stressors that military personnel face that that would not be faced by the civilian population, which could inform how we provide services to them, especially as they seek services outside of the military context?
Absolutely.
Would you like to respond, Colonel?
Yes, ma'am. So,
This is being recorded, by the way. It's Olelo is here, so we appreciate speaking into the mic.
yes, ma'am. I'd like, in addition to what Ms. Morita was stating, is that we are unique in that you mentioned that in the opening statement in terms of deployment. Our operational tempo is high. As we move out of the deployment cycle into the training cycle, I still think it remains the same. The stressors are there, long hours, isolation, and lack of support, much what you had mentioned early on. So I think that those are the key differences between the civilian and the military population.
As long as you're responding, Colonel, the Army's testimony indicated various kinds of collaborations and MOUs, and my understanding is that these are with state agencies, that you have these collaborative models or MOUs.
That is correct. We have, I apologize.
No,
Thank you. We have 2 formal MOUs, one with the Child Welfare Service as well as the Children's Justice Center.
So are those state agencies?
Yes.
And since we have nonprofit providers here, do you have any kind of collaboration with them?
We do not have formal agreements, but we do a lot of informal partnerships. One of the things that actually all of our services do is that we are on different committees and meetings that we sit in to support, to provide information, as well as we do referrals and we do programs and activities together.
So is this in any kind of a formal way? Is there some kind of a group, committee that you do this through?
Okay. So we do not have a formal group or committee, but what we do have the Military Family Advocacy Coordinating Council. And what that is a program that's actually been around for numerous years. I would like to say about 20 years, approximately 20 years. And what we did is we got together, and it's something that we continue to meet. So all the different branches of services are on it, as well as the Coast Guard. We have civilian agencies that come and share information and resources. Some of them attend regularly, some we invite as we see trends in the community or friction points or things that we can get together to talk about and about different programs or our different needs that we're seeing.
Do you think that perhaps a more formal kind of a group would be helpful to enhance and strengthen the collaboration between the civilian and the military provider communities?
We're also, we certainly can look at anything that could enhance collaboration and us working together.
Because the resources are getting actually less for a problem that defies easy solutions, as I mentioned. So
I definitely share your concerns, because we definitely want to work together to make sure we're providing the best services for our families.
Ms. Ogden, you hosted me on a visit to your Pearl Harbor's Family Advocacy Facility, and I thank you for that. Expanding on Ms. Morita's response regarding some of the common factors that apply to domestic violence, whether it's happening in the military context or in the civilian context, could you elaborate a little more? I know that the Colonel provided some of that, but as a person who's dealing on a day-to-day basis with the military families, what are some really specific and unique factors exhibited by military families experiencing domestic violence?
Well, certainly those stressors around deployment and the anticipation of separation and then reintegration are challenges. I do think that all the military branches put a lot of services in place because they know those are stressors. Mm-hmm. So to put things in place to do education for not only the service members but also the family members around what are common things that come up as we approach this and anticipated separations. Often more conflicts arise. People will start emotionally kind of pushing away from one another, so we want to help educate them that that's a normal part of the process. And so the more we can help them see that that's normal, and here are ways to cope with that, keep communication lines clear, have a plan of action, that can help them not see that as some personal failure or something that they're doing wrong. Then also for reintegration, we have lots of programs to try to help them look at what are some of the things that have happened since people were away, and that the one family member or spouse that was left behind has had to run the show. So now we have to find a way to fit the deployed member back into the family unit, and what are some of the challenges with that, and how can we give them some skills and understanding so they can reintegrate better. So I think for those very specific challenges that they have as military members, there really are, because of that recognition by the military, there's been a lot of support services put in place to specifically address that.
Yes, and of course recognizing that military families do go outside of the military provider community to access services in the private sector. So to the extent that you have this kind of awareness about the specific stressors and how to deal with them, there is a question as to whether that kind of intelligence and information and approaches are shared with the private providers, and whether that could definitely be enhanced.
Sure, I think there's always room for enhancements. I think some of our partnerships, like say with the local schools, to help them understand what how children are being impacted by these kind of separations. So we have gone specifically to the schools and help educate the administrators, the school administrators and the teachers, so that they can also understand some of those very military-specific stressors and what they can do to help support the military children and families, and also so that they're aware of our military resources that are available. I think Military OneSource and TRICARE, as they expand their network of civilian providers, have also made efforts to try to educate those providers about military-specific stressors so that they can help those civilian providers understand those challenges that are unique and help to maybe learn some of the language that I think would help make military families feel comfortable going outside and working with civilian providers.
Thank
so
you.
I think there are efforts, yes.
I'll get to my second round probably, but my time is up, so I'd like to turn to Senator Schatz for his questions, and then followed by Senator Representative Hanabusa.
Thank you, Senator Hirono. My question is for Ms. Morita and Ms. Ogden. Can you describe your staffing structure and whether you have sufficient resources to meet the need?
We actually have fairly similar staffing structures. So what we have are new parent support home visitors. And so those are social workers and nurses who do home visits with parents with children up to 0 to 3. We have educators, FAP educators, who do our trainings and classes. We have victim advocates who provide victim advocacy services, as I mentioned earlier. Thank you, Dawn. And as well as on the clinical side, I might take a moment to let Colonel Rinkel-Ryan speak to his clinical staffing.
So within our clinical staff, the family advocacy behavioral health is part of a behavioral health service line. And within the behavioral health service line, we provide an array of behavioral health services. An example is child and family behavioral health service, patient-centered medical home. We've got the embedded behavioral health, and so we have I would say a robust behavioral health service, at least to provide support for our family advocacy families.
You have enough in the way of staffing.
So to answer your question, so based on our current caseload, we are adequately resourced, but we're always continually assessing our situation to see as we look at the complexities of our cases.
And what's the reporting structure from the FAP program? How does it work through the different branches of the service?
In terms of reporting an incident of...
No, I mean the chain of command. I mean,
Okay,
who's getting these data? Who is being made aware of what's going on in terms of the aggregate data for, obviously, individual cases? There's the question of restricted or unrestricted, but who is keeping an eyeball on these programs from the standpoint of providing services to service members' families?
So in our program, the Army program, it's not as similar as the Navy. We have the prevention and the treatment services that are under different command. The family advocacy, which falls under the Army Community Services Prevention, belongs to the Installation Management Command. My service, the Behavioral Health Services, belongs to the Medical Command, which falls under the Surgeon General, the Army Surgeon General.
Does that make sense?
At this point, it does. We would need to look at the review, do a review of maybe a bottom-up review analysis to see if we could, if it does make sense to keep it the way it is, or.
Okay, thank you. And then one additional question for Ms. Morita and Ms. Ogden. How do you develop best practices, and how standardized are these FAP programs? Do you have flexibility to implement it as you see fit at each base and in each installation, or does this come from big DoD? And I guess my basic concern is that you want enough flexibility to implement according to the individual needs. On the other hand, there are best practices, and so you don't want each administrator to develop a program out of whole cloth. So I'm interested in where you get your best practices and your standards and how that gets developed.
So absolutely, I think there is a framework that the DoD, OSD has said now all branches of service, you will use the same set of definitions, the DoD maltreatment definitions. We want you to all use the same process of the committee that determines whether this meets those definitions for abuse or neglect. So that is somewhere, you know, just happened in the last several years to really try to get that consistency across all branches of services so that DoD and OSD can really look that we're comparing oranges to oranges. With the Navy has this many numbers, the Army has this many, are we talking about the same thing? So I think that is there, and that has been a really useful thing to try to get us using all those same frameworks. But as speaking for the Navy, I can say that those best practices, certainly our headquarters is always looking for best practices, whether that's something that one, you know, installation started up or some new evidence-based program. So what they know, they will certainly share and offer that with all of the installations. We are given the latitude to try things here, you know, and to find things that work for our specific community, any command specific, because each command can have a little different flavor. So
right.
Absolutely, we are given that.
Senator Hirono, if you'll indulge me one last question, you'll save
Go
me a
ahead.
second round. My question is about who's aggregating all of these data, and I think that's for the Attorney General. My concern is, just as a general proposition, as we saw the reporting of sexual assault in the military go up, we were, I think, correctly informed that that was actually a good thing, not a bad thing, because of people reporting it and more public awareness around it. And I'm not entirely sure whether the increase in incidents of domestic violence is as a result of an actual increase or an increase in services and reporting. And I don't think we have time to address that particular question. I'm not sure it's knowable at this point, but the question of who's aggregating the data and analyzing it, I think is not, there's no clear answer yet. Attorney General?
The answer I can give you is that the data that we are analyzing and aggregating does not generally include military data. We get our data from the police departments, from the prosecutors, from the judiciary, and where military service people come into contact with those institutions, then we may have some of that data. But I think to the extent, I mean, I don't have any links with the military directly. We do not get this data. So, I mean, we certainly could if those channels were opened up. But right now, we do not aggregate any of that data on a regular, systemized basis.
That seems like something that we ought to work on as a community, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Congresswoman Hanabusa.
Thank you, Senator Hirono. In your testimony, is it Colonel Arinkorian
Yes, ma'am.
or Ms. Morita? In your testimony, you pointed out something that I'd like clarification on. You said there are about 15,000 married active duty soldiers with an average of 46% living on post and 54% living off post. So where they are living, does that affect who they may report more to? In other words, if you're living off post, is there a higher probability, for example, that if something would happen, that it would be HPD on Oahu, for example, that would be called versus somebody within the military itself, versus when you're living on post, it would be something that would be, of course, covered by whatever your structure is in place on post?
Well, certainly where a service member lives can impact where they intersect with services. A couple of things that might be important to note is our reporting process. So there's a mandated reporting process. So if a commander or is aware that there's been an incident, they're required to report back to us on post, as well as we have agreements that if a member is arrested for domestic violence, that report gets sent to the military police, and then we're informed of the incident. So it definitely has an impact in terms of maybe who is initial responder in that situation.
Ms. Ogden, do you have any statistics like that as to your military and Air Force because you're representing the Joint Base?
Yes, we have just under 20,000 active duty Navy and Air Force members and approximately 24,000 family members. Of those, most Air Force families, that's 83% approximately, currently live on installation. So their first responders would be military law enforcement. Our Navy families is pretty much the opposite, where only 14% of our Navy families live on installation. The rest would be living out on the economy or in the public-private venture housing, which is also the primary, while it's federal, is the primary jurisdiction of HPD. So, but I know that they will also contact our military law enforcement folks and sometimes, decide who will take that case further.
One of the issues that we've always struggled with in this area has been, for example, the confidentiality of it. And I think it was attested to earlier that there was a concern about how it may then affect the job or the promotion structure of one spouse, whoever that spouse may be, in terms of military. So in light of all of that, do you have any assessment as to whether the way it's reported, in other words, what then gets reported to the military police or whoever, then it goes up the chain to the commander, that somehow that's affecting the number of people who are actually seeking help because they don't want that future for their family and their spouse to be affected? Is that a criteria that in their mind you see being played out?
Go ahead. You sure? Okay. So I know that one of the things that was developed was a restricted report for that very reason, and the intent behind it is that we wanted family members and soldiers to be able to come forward to get services without triggering that response, to give them time to find out what services are available, as well as to seek treatment. So that's one of the things that the Department of Defense started, was the restricted report to address those issues.
But is there at some point when that restricted report becomes unrestricted, when, for example, there's a pattern of behavior or something like that, that it just automatically then, you don't have the benefit of that protection? And the only reason I'm asking this is because the culture of the military is very different than our private sector. So what is it about that culture? And we're just finding out more and more as we have hearings in Washington about what goes on within our uniformed personnel. So it must even be a different and a greater concern among family members who don't even have that. So what then would happen? Is there something that says, okay, at this point, you're no longer protected? Because the military personnel do not have the same kind of rights that you might have. Anyone know?
Let me just answer this, Ms. Ma'am. In speaking with the restricted reporting, we try as much as possible to keep confidentiality in all the cases that occur. And if restricted reporting is granted to the victim, there may be a threshold that we will meet that we no longer can keep restricted reporting. It's usually when there is imminent harm to the individual as well as children that may be involved, that we must get commanders or the appropriate authorities involved to mitigate risk. And that is usually the time when we will break confidentiality.
So it is something that can be broken given the set of circumstances. It isn't something that somebody just is entitled to. They will and that can be broken depending on the criteria that whoever's
Yes, ma'am,
reviewing
it's in our
it has.
policies, in the
Right.
Department of Defense policy.
Okay. So, thank you.
Thank you. I think that we recognize, and particularly as both Congresswoman Hanabusa and I serve on the Armed Services Committees of our respective bodies, that we're dealing with very, very unique environment with regard to the military. And for Attorney General Louis also, regardless of some numbers that we've seen that domestic violence is decreasing, which I find kind of astounding, that 75% decrease. You indicated that it is a problem. We don't necessarily know the full extent of this problem in either the military side or the civilian side, because just as sexual assault is underreported, probably this is also underreported, and so there's a whole other aspect of information and education that is part of the component of how we address this issue. So I think for the military, thank you, both of you, for raising the question of how do military victims, how safe do they feel in coming forward, and it's probably an issue that we could, I'm sure the military is wrestling with. And there's restricted reporting for the Army. Is there a restricted reporting in?
Yes.
But we don't know, what the cause and effects are of putting these kinds of options available, whether that results in more people feeling that they can come forward and talk to you folks, access your services, or not. And in fact, when it comes to the issue of sexual assault in the military, we did get information from the Pentagon as to how many instances were occurring and what was being reported, what was being prosecuted. Is there that kind of data gathering with regard to domestic violence in the military?
Well, I know a relatively new, it's going to be the formal data gathering will start here in October with the severity codes. And that is where that's going to be first presented to Congress, I believe, in 2016. And that is where all the branches of the military are going to be looking at domestic violence specifically, and sexual assault within an intimate partner relationship. And if we have specific criteria that if that meets for a moderate to severe level of abuse, then those cases will be, that will be in our central registry database that each of the branches of service have. And then concurrently, we will then be notifying the commands. The commands will know that this has been identified as a case where they will be looking at the service member's personnel record to then see what the command has done to take some action. And that can be, it just needs to show that the command considered that. It does not mean they have to have taken a specific action.
So, excuse me, Ms. Ogden. So is this requirement for data gathering across all services?
Yes.
So
and
this is a directive from
yes.
the Pentagon or from
Congress,
Secretary Hagel and us?
And OSD is the one putting out all of the information on this. So this is, we're starting to gather this data, starting with all cases that are opened as of 1 October.
That would be helpful to your efforts. I'm assuming this study will be, as you said, made public, and because the Attorney General has mentioned that you have no data as to what's happening in the military context on the incidence of
where it stays only in the military,
yes.
We have no data at all.
Yeah. So I'd like to ask all of you, we've been talking about coordinated community response, and there are MOUs with regard to state agencies, and there are different efforts being made to provide a coordinated community response. Would you all agree that we can do better with bringing all the parties together, and that efforts should be made toward that goal?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
I would certainly agree with that.
That is called a trick question. No, it's not. No, we need to be on the same page, because this is a really tough community-wide problem. Thank you very much. If my colleagues do not have further questions, we'll move on to panel 2. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
So on the second panel, I will do a brief introduction as you're coming forward. Okay, while that's being set up, I'd like to start by introducing our next panel, consisting of Nancy Kriegman, and she is the Chief Executive Officer of Domestic Violence Action Center, DVAC, and Marcy Lopes. So Nancy has been working on addressing family violence in Hawaii for 30 years and is widely recognized for her advocacy. She has been honored for her work by a number of organizations, including the YWCA and the National Association of Social Workers. Marcy Lopes is the Executive Director of the Hawaii State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Marcy has a master's degree in counseling psychology, and prior to serving as the Executive Director of the coalition, Marcy worked with Parents and Children Together, a large and leading domestic violence service provider in Hawaii. Before we begin with your testimony, I'd like to swear you in, so if you can stand and raise your hand. Do you affirm that the testimony you are about to give before the committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Please. So we will start with you, Nancy.
Thank you. Thank you very much for bringing us together. As I think was apparent in the first panel, there's a kind of a climb we can all do together. So the opportunity to have our...
I think you need to speak into the mic.
I need to speak into the mic too, okay. I thank you for inviting us here today. I think as it was apparent to all of us during the first panel, there's some work we can do together. So having our congressional delegation involved in the conversation is key to moving forward. The Domestic Violence Action Center, you probably already know, provides direct services and community mobilization addressing domestic violence. We have a staff of 52 who are dedicated to delivering direct services, professional training, outreach, and participating in system reform work. It's a complex problem, it's a costly problem, and it's an enormous problem that touches all of our families, as you have all said, and our military colleagues have said. The Domestic Violence Action Center has been involved in almost every effort to examine the problem of domestic violence over the last nearly 25 years. And it's our intention to stay in the conversation. We work with thousands of families every year, and it has not recently occurred to us, but has occurred to us some time ago, that at least 10% and sometimes as many as 20% of the families we are serving at any one time are military families or military family members. And we have wanted to have a conversation with the Department of Defense or the Department of Justice or our military colleagues and our congressional delegation about the impact of serving the military community and the potential ways it may detract from our ability to serve the civilian community. This does not mean we're not willing to serve and work with the military, but it does cost us money. As a civilian nonprofit agency, we are always yearning to increase our revenues. And if we can receive the support and the cooperation of the military, we think that would be in the best interest of the community as a whole. You alluded earlier, Senator Hirono, to the data that we collected. After beginning a conversation which was really inspired by Adriana Romelli from the Sex Abuse Treatment Center at the VAWA Planning Committee, the Domestic Violence Action Center and some of our other domestic violence programs designated a 2-week period of time where we were going to lift out the number of people that our staff serves.
Excuse me, let me replace this.
So we did that. We instructed all of our staff to make an inquiry about who it is that they were providing safety planning with, who it is that they were making contacts. Our staff provide long-term advocacy and legal representation to victims of domestic violence or survivors of domestic violence. In that 2-week period, which was September 15th through September 30th, safety planning was conducted 40 times. Safety planning is not an event, it's rather it's a process. When circumstances change, we revisit the threats to a person and examine what kinds of changes they may need to make in their safety plan. That's a very exhaustive process. Again, it's an important one for all the people we have contact with. Our staff made 104 contacts with the military clients that they were working with just during that 2-week period, and 52 additional contacts with other people out in the community. As people are navigating their way to safety, there's lots of encounters with other agencies. So our work is to make sure that the rest of the people they're interacting with understand the challenges, understand the pathway, understand the risk. So that's a big commitment by our staff in support of the military. Again, we're happy to be there to be able to help our military families, but it comes at a cost to our civilian community, quite honestly. The other thing that is maybe a little bit delicate, but something I would like to place on the table, and that is depending on the branch of the military and the individual command, we have different degrees of cooperation and responsiveness. Some of the survivors we work with face a lot of challenges and many obstacles to getting safe, to getting services that they need, and to getting their abusers held accountable. So the opportunity to engage in greater conversation and maybe more collaboration in a coordinated fashion, we think would be in the best interest of the survivors who might be having difficulty with the branch or the commander. So we're on board. These are just a few thoughts and a conversation that I hope we can continue to have. Again, my thanks for each of you coming and convening our community.
Thank you. Ms. Lopes?
Thank you for this opportunity. I would briefly like to take a few minutes to share with you all that my father went to Vietnam when I was 3 days old. He went on to have a 21-year career with the United States Army. Upon retiring from the Army, he has enjoyed a 25-plus year career working for the VA. My husband also has 21 years of service to the military. For the past 11 and a half years, he has and continues to proudly serve our Air National Guard. So I have an intimate understanding of the challenges many of our military families face. I'm the executive director for the Hawaii State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. I started this position in March of this year. Our coalition is a membership of 22 organizations statewide. They all provide domestic violence services. Our mission is to engage communities and organizations to end domestic violence through education, advocacy, and action for social change. I'm speaking today about some of the life-saving services provided to the residents of Hawaii because of the existence of VAWA and FIPSA. The island of Oahu reported to me the greatest demands on services being accessed by military members and dependents. The island of Oahu provides aid for families from the Air Force, Army, Navy, Marines, Coast Guard, as well as the National Guard and Army Reserves. Services are not only accessed by legal dependents, they're also accessed by intimate partners who may not be married to the service member. We also have adult children and other family members who are accessing our services. Since its passage in 1984, FIPSA has remained the only direct federal funding source for our shelters. FIPSA currently funds 9 domestic violence emergency shelters statewide. I have to take this unique opportunity to share that our shelters in Hawaii are still recovering from funding cuts that they experienced in 2008. Our Molokai shelter, the most isolated of our shelters, reported to me this morning that they're functioning with a 45% budget cut that they experienced in 2008. I attached in my my information to you the most recent shelter utilization data. So we have 9 shelters, 4 operating on Oahu. 2 are operated by Child and Family Service, 1 in Honolulu and 1 in Leeward. We have 1 operated by Parents and Children Together that services families in Kaneohe, and we have 1 operated by the Women's Spouse Abuse Shelter in Kailua. The Hawaii Island operates 2 shelters by Child and Family Service, 1 in Hilo and 1 in Kona. We have 1 shelter operated by the YWCA in Kauai, and 1 operated in Maui by Women Helping Women. We also have our Molokai shelter operated by the Molokai Community Council, Haliho'omalu. There is a military shelter available on Oahu, but it is not staffed. Active duty and spouses can access that shelter after contacting the military crisis line and getting a referral. Victims are only allowed to stay 2 weeks. If they need additional time, that has to be approved by the chain of command. Oahu service providers have shared that many military victims prefer to access local shelters because they have staff available 24/7. They can stay 90 days, and they do not trust the military restricted and unrestricted reporting levels. Victims have also reported that they are fearful that the perpetrator's chain of command will be able to keep them safe and to hold their abuser accountable. When events occur off base, there are jurisdiction challenges. If the police department makes a report because the event took place off base, victims and perpetrators can choose to access services off base. The Hawaii judicial system is involved. They can mandate military personnel to batterer intervention programs. We have 2 service providers on Oahu that provide batterer intervention services. That's Parents and Children Together and Child and Family Service. If a victim in Hawaii applies for a restraining order, a child welfare case is started, and so many of military families are also involved in child welfare services. So we have 3 agencies who provide services for those families: Child and Family Service for Leeward, Oahu, the Domestic Violence Action Center for Central Oahu, and Parents and Children Together for Windward, Oahu. If a military dependent child is in need of counseling services, they can access the Parents and Children Together Family Peace Center program. The military does not have therapeutic groups for children at this time, but I was told they do have individual and counseling services for the families available on some facilities. Because of the lack of affordable housing and the inventory of housing in the open market, many of our victims are returning to their abuser or becoming homeless as a result of their domestic violence. The Violence Against Women Act provides much needed transitional housing programs on our island, but it's still not enough. Only 3 of our islands are benefiting from this transitional housing program. On Oahu, we have Child and Family Service, who is able to provide services for victims and their children. Parents and Children Together operates a transitional home for single women only. That's 8 beds. Maui has, Women Helping Women has a transitional housing program that does service women and children. And then Hawaii Island Child and Family Service has a transitional housing program for victims and children. Oahu also receives Safe Haven and state judiciary funding for supervised visitation centers. Visitation centers operate to keep children and victims safe while families are going through the TRO process, a custody dispute, or a highly conflicted divorce. If visitation is not handled properly, it puts children at risk for being abused, kidnapped, or further harm to the custodial parent. Many military families are accessing the visitation center. They are able to provide Skype visits for families that are deployed or have been stationed off island. So that service is being accessed. And there's 1 center on Oahu for all of our families. They service over 250 families a year, over 3,000 visits. There is a waiting list, and families get an hour and a half visit per week if they're lucky.
Can you wrap up, Ms. Lopes?
Sure, sorry.
We have your full testimony.
Okay. I will end there. We have many dedicated service providers. We have a great need for legal services, and I want to thank you for your continued support.
Thank you. I understand that Senator Schatz has to leave, so thank you very much for joining us. We shall move forward together. This is for Ms. Lopes, because you are you oversee a lot of,
Yes,
or
ma'am.
you collect data from a number of programs, and there are quite a few of them, although the need is still greater than the
Right,
resources. Attorney General said that of the VAWA funding, a portion of it goes to you folks. And how do you decide which shelters on which island, what how they get VAWA money, or do they get VAWA money?
The coalition does not make that decision. The AG's office determines that. We are able to give input during the planning meetings.
Oh, so for clarification, then the Attorney General actually designates whether the Molokai shelter will get what amounts?
FIPSA is the only one that funds the shelters, and that's not
Okay, I just
that's
use
not
that
the
as
Attorney
an
General's
example, but
funding.
Whatever the Attorney General's funding decisions
They
are, they
decide.
do the decisions.
It's a competitive process.
Oh,
So everybody makes a proposal, submits it to the Attorney General's office, and they have
I
a
see.
process.
thank you. So I asked our panel one people as we focus on the coordinated community response, I think you indicated that depending on which service, depending on which commander, because the commander of the facilities, our installations have a lot of leeway as to how things proceed under their command, that we could do more to facilitate the ability of you folks in particular to be able to provide the kind of services that the military people who are coming to you get. So in your experience, we talked about in the first panel, well, first of all, let me ask whether you agree that we could do better with
Absolutely.
whatever the, however way we structure this. Do you think a more formal way of communicating with the military would help than what exists
Yeah.
right now?
Mhm.
Okay. With regard to the very specific experiences that may be stressors for domestic violence, Ms. Creedman, as you provide direct services, are there some very specific ways that you work with military victims that you may not do with the other victims as you do your safety planning? For example, I was informed that you are concerned about the access to firearms more with the military people that you work with. Can you just talk a little bit about those
Well,
kinds of unique circumstances that lead you to provide a different kind of services to military people?
I think that's a trick question, too.
It's not meant to be.
Yeah. There are factors that are true for all survivors. There are root causes that are that exist in all battering relationships. The uniqueness of a military family member being victimized by her perpetrator has something to do with her isolation, her lack of familiarity with the community that she's in, the lack of confidence she may have in her husband's command, the ability to know when it is appropriate to ask for what, the level of lethality in the relationship needs to be assessed, the kind of responsibilities and maybe work schedules of their partner or perpetrator needs to be understood. So we don't start our assessment or our support as if they're very different populations. We start with the assumption that there's some very strong similarities between what is happening for a victim in the civilian community and a victim in the military community. And then we distill out the parts of the relationship or the danger or the perpetrator's role in the military to figure out, is there something special or different or more intensive that we must do in order to assure her access to the right kind of services in the right order and taking into consideration the lethality that she's facing.
So as you're doing the safety planning, it sounds as though it's a very individualized, intensive process.
Yeah.
So if you know that you're dealing with someone from the military, though, does that trigger certain kinds of questions that you would ask to regarding their particular situations and what concerns they may have about accessing you folks as opposed to the military services?
Yes. It's also evident to us, because it's been disclosed over and over again, that they come to us because they don't find the military resources either safe or have the confidence in them because of the, earlier it was said that all reports are made to the military police. That may or may not be a good thing for a particular, and the level of fear and terror and torment that a victim is experiencing is exacerbated by the lack of familiarity with the community they're in, with the installation they're on, and
so the military is concerned about how to deal with it, and one of the responses has been to allow for restricted reporting. This could be an area, though, where from the civilian provider community standpoint, that may be better, stronger communication as to what is causing the military families to not go to the military. Mm-hmm. Maybe there are other approaches that could be implemented mm-hmm. by the military to mm-hmm. address the situation. So a lot of my questions have to do with trying to understand what's out there and what does the military person who, as you say, is away from familiar surroundings, and how do you think they get the information as to what's available for them if they are the victim of domestic violence? And I'm talking about the majority of the cases probably do not have police involvement or not. I don't know what percentage mm-hmm. of the cases HPD, for example, on Oahu, are involved, or what percentage of the domestic violence situations are people who don't want to involve the police but who seek help.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have I'll just give you an example. We have a program on site at court. So every person who's petitioning family court for a restraining order has the opportunity to have a conversation with a staff member from the Domestic Violence Action Center. So the military families use our family court system in the same way that the civilian community does. So that's one place where they would meet people who work with the Domestic Violence Action Center. So they could be referred at that point to additional services in the civilian community. If there are 54% of military families live off post, mm-hmm. any encounter with law enforcement would be our civilian police, and they're certainly familiar with our domestic violence programs and would make referrals to our domestic violence programs. I'm not as well acquainted with how the communication goes or the collaboration occurs between the Honolulu Police Department and the military bases, although I know that there is improved communication among them.
I'm told that if HPD is involved and there is an arrest, then that information goes to the command. Mm-hmm. My time is up. Congresswoman Hanabusa. I'll get to other questions.
Thank you, Senator. Nancy, let's, first of all, I just want to say it's typical you to just cut to the chase. If we do more military, it's going to take away from civilian. And that really is a concern. I mean, I can see that. But can you give me an idea of how much, as you're gathering data, how much of the numbers that you would service, or potentially could be servicing, could have the military relationship? Do you have any idea of what that might be, as you're now being more sensitive in gathering this particular piece of data?
I'm not sure I understand your question. I'm thinking that if we're serving 15% of our
Right.
caseload at any given time,
Right.
our military family members, if we had funds, we could increase our resources so that we could also be serving the 15% of the civilian community whose cases we can't open or accept.
That's exactly
Yeah.
what I was thinking about.
Yeah.
That because what you were saying was, you know, as you, if you handle the military, which is not something you're objecting to, but it
Right.
also means you can't handle the civilian
Correct.
population, and there's no compensation per se,
Correct.
as what I heard you. So if
Yeah.
it's about 15% or something like that. I guess I'm trying to figure out, the resources are limited all the way
Right.
around,
Right.
but it seems like if it's a service that's being provided, that it is a service that should be compensated somehow, because
Would
you're
be very
picking up
nice.
slack. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I'm not sure even if the military branches have specialized legal services for those victims of domestic violence in the same way that we do.
That's right. Now, the other thing that I was reading your testimony that caught my eye was when you said from 2009 to 2014, 37.2 of all divorce cases sampled in the state judiciary,
Right.
at least one member was military. And I just want to be clear, when you define military, was the definition of the military used active duty versus guard and reserve? Do you see the difference that I'm trying to
Yeah.
draw?
I think it's both.
It's both?
I think it's both. That came out of a report issued by
Right.
the.
I saw it here.
By the family court, yeah. The
So
judiciary.
do you know, or are you familiar enough with the report to know if though it may be, you know, a no-fault divorce, whether how many of them may have been related to issues of domestic violence? Do you have any idea? If you do.
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know.
I'm going to move now to Marcy. And Marcy, I want to thank you for your testimony because you're very detailed in the military impact. The one thing that I was wondering about, because it seemed like given the nature of the military families, especially those are active duty in a new place, you know, because they serve 2 to 3 years max and they're moving on, that you did mention that there is just one shelter available, but there's no one that staffs that shelter, right? And yet we do know. And then you also said that the FVPSA program is the only one that funds shelters.
Yes.
Yet we all know that VAWA funds transitional housing. So is transitional housing once the person decides to move completely out versus a sheltered situation?
It could be either one. They could go from an emergency shelter to transitional, or if they're working with an advocate that's able to refer them directly to the transitional housing programs, that can happen. And sometimes DVAC or Hawaii Immigrant Justice Center, they have advocates working on legal issues with them, and they're able to get them into transitional.
Because it would seem that for a military person who is being abused and needs shelter, that they need to be out of that situation. But as was testified, they find themselves returning because there is no alternative.
Yes.
There's no family structure here for most cases. They are isolated, and you know that where do they turn to? So it's almost like forcing them back into the situation. Would that be a correct assessment?
Yes, ma'am.
So another thing you said is that they don't trust the chain of command, that the chain of command, it's almost like an assumption that the chain of command will protect whoever is in the service, and they don't feel that they will be in any way protected from that. Is that the sense that you're getting from the
Majority
military?
of the victims, yes.
So this is not a trick question. So in a situation like this, where we do, and you went to great detail to show your understanding of being a member of a military family, plus a spouse of somebody who has very strong military ties. Now, what do you do then? I mean, how do you address something as fundamental as where do they turn?
I think we have a unique situation here in Hawaii because we are so isolated. The coalition operates a program called Flight to Freedom, and if we do have victims that need to leave the island because they're in imminent danger, we use our funds to help them fly home to their family and their support system.
So it is putting them back into their
Their-
ohana, in
yes.
other words. And is that the most effective way that you have found in the experiences that you have for those that are clearly, this would be probably a category that doesn't qualify. The restricted report would probably be unrestricted, but is this the best solution for them?
It depends on their safety. If they're really terrified and they feel that their life's in danger, they want out of here as quickly as possible. But I also have to note that the past 2 to 3 years, we've seen many women meet service members online, and they're flying over here to Hawaii, depleting all of their savings and finding out that this person is an abuser, and now they're stranded here in Hawaii and they're accessing our shelters, and we're trying to get them back. So that's also a challenge that we're having right now.
Can you give us an idea of how many of these flights to freedom in a particular year or whatever, however you keep your data, and where do you find the money?
We solicit foundations, private grants, and after speaking with Cody, we learned the value that we should be tracking how many military service members we're providing this to, but it's a very special fund that we use, and after we purchase the tickets, we try and destroy any evidence that we ever made this purchase. And so we have the total numbers of tickets that we purchased, but we don't keep any identifying information. So I don't have the numbers in my mind right now, but we can get that to you.
Okay, so that is the ultimate release
Yes.
for that they can look to.
Immediate.
Can I just add one thing? There's also negotiation that occurs around the early return of dependents that is sometimes employed when a person needs to leave.
Thank you, Senator.
Getting back to the flights to freedom. So did you say that you don't have the information as to how much your organizations have spent to return spouses?
We have the total, but we have not been keeping track of which are military dependents. We have not been keeping that data. We recently started tracking that.
And you use your own resources to return abused persons to much more supportive surroundings.
Yes.
And Nancy, you're right that the military does have an early release of dependents, which is similar to return the dependents to a much safer situation. So that's been another one of the military's responses and how to best provide.
And I
the
believe
kind of
that's only if
service.
they're married dependents.
There may be restrictions, and
yeah.
this could be yet another identifying of how best the civilian and the military communities can work together. I'm having a difficulty figuring out whether there are overlaps to the services provided by the civilian side and the military side. Do the people who come to you, basically, they just come to you, they're not accessing the military service
So
providers?
if a victim calls the shelter and they're taken into shelter, if she discloses that she would like the shelter advocates, the local advocates, to work with the family advocacy programs, they will, but that's completely up to the victim. It's her decision.
So if the victim chooses to use the FAP program, then you don't provide the services that FAP is providing to that person.
Right.
That's not entirely the same for us. Sometimes we work very closely with the Family Advocacy Program, and some of the services that we provide are a little bit different. And so we try, it's entirely up to the survivor, where she wants to get help. and in what ways. Sometimes there's a good collaboration between the Domestic Violence Action Center and the Family Advocacy Program. Sometimes, not so much, for a variety of different reasons. So there's not really duplication. Sometimes there's cooperation, and sometimes they come to DVAC, and that's all that's the entirety of their support.
It's been mentioned by all of us many times that the resources are scarce, and while Ms. Krugman, you are great at raising money and advocating for that, let us assume there will be no additional funds. And in fact, I believe the Attorney General in his testimony said the VAWA funding has not increased in 5 years, even as we've expanded, by the way, the groups and people that VAWA will now protect. So we have to be very creative here. So what would you say would be the biggest challenge that you'd like to have a coordinated community response team address with regard to your ability, your group's ability to help service member families?
I think I need to understand what we mean when we use the phrase coordinated community response. Who comes to the table? What's the work we're doing together? What are the expectations that everybody brings when they come to the table? What can we agree on? What is the work that needs to be forged so that we're not duplicating services and we're cooperating? I don't really know exactly what we mean by a coordinated community response between the civilian and the military communities. So maybe that's the first step.
Yes.
Again, since we've got 5 different branches of the military, and each one of them is their own little domain, that in and of itself is a kind of a challenge. The Army may want to approach it in one way, the Marines may want to approach it in a different way, the Air Force may want to approach it in a different way. So is the coordination among the branches and the civilian community, or is the coordination between a branch and the civilian community? I'm not entirely certain.
I would say that this is why going forward, it does behoove us to at least use the same terminology and come to a common understanding. And would you want to add anything to what Ms. Krugman has
I believe that the
said?
military has lots of training resources that we could better utilize.
Training resources?
Yes, they bring excellent trainers over, but we have not been able to coordinate. I think it's a goal. Cindy recently joined our fatality review team, and she's been able to share now some of the training resources that we have. So I think that's an easy way that we can start coordinating.
So as you sit there and I see this is your, we're going to be ending this hearing earlier, and which is good. Yes, and good. So as you're thinking about some ways that we can move things along, feel free. I'll turn to Representative Hanabusa for additional questions.
Thank you. I'm kind of stuck. And the reason I'm stuck is because I'm trying to understand this from the perspective of the victim or the person who's seeking help. And if that person who seeks help, like Nancy, you said, DVAC may be the only agency that they choose to go with. And it seems like at some point that if you are coordinating, that it would be, and if we are, quote, getting compensated for expenses, which is a logical thing to happen. But then the question becomes, what about the person who is seeking the help? If that person doesn't want anything, any knowledge of this to go back to the military, for whatever that reasons may be, and wants to just seek help from DVAC or from one of your groups, how do we do this? Because it seems like in the process, we're losing sight of the person who is seeking the help.
We would never disclose any military connections or information if she did not want us to. It would only be if she preferred that we contact them. She can completely come and access all of our member programs
But you
with
see
complete confidentiality.
No, I agree. But the reality of how do you then do the funding, right? How do you get compensated for that? As Nancy put it very aptly, as she does in the beginning, you know, you're taking money away
Yes.
from the community. Not that the community doesn't want to, but you're limited. Everybody's limited in the amount of resources. And it would seem that this is something that you're doing a service to the military as well. But you know, that's the difficulty that I'm having, and I'm not sure that the military will be willing to just take a number. We have 3 this month. Take our word for it. We'll sign an affidavit that we have 3 this month. I mean, do you understand what I'm getting at? And I'm just trying to figure out, how does the person fit into what we are talking about here?
A person might have sought assistance from the military several times, and it didn't yield the outcome that was felt supportive to her, at which point she may seek help someplace else. Sometimes that's how we get military family member survivor clients. I don't know. I mean, I think we'd have to figure that out.
Right.
Through the coordination and through the cooperation
Right.
and through the increased and improved communication, we might figure out how to report. I mean, we report to other funding sources, lots of details, without disclosing who the clients are that we're serving.
Because I think for a lot, if a client is seeking help from you and wants that level of confidentiality, it probably has to do with the spouse and not wanting that spouse to be affected in any way.
Right.
You know, that which may or may not be. It's probably not good for the military not to know. You know, they should know if they have somebody who is abusing or something, and as a result of that, they should know. But yet it's this tension, and I don't know what the answer is. I just threw it out. But thank you very
Thank you.
much, Senator.
So, as with sexual assault, we want to encourage reporting in the civilian community as well as in the military community. And I think it's also important to keep in mind that the military they are very much a part of our community, and they should be able to access services wherever they feel comfortable. When we get down to some of the nitty-gritty of how the resources can come together to do as best as we can, then that's another matter for a coordinated response. It's very clear that this is a very complicated situation. We're very complicated, no easy solutions. And so as we go forward, I do ask our military colleagues who are here and our civilian community for cooperation as we go forward, because, you know, as I mentioned in my opening statement, I do anticipate moving forward with a collaboration model that is more than you all should be talking together more. I'd like to see a model that can be implemented, and we're certainly, I certainly would be interested to know if other jurisdictions have models that we can follow, and there must be, because when VAWA was first enacted, it did have the military collaboration component as part of the community response. So it takes willing hearts to go there, and as I close this hearing, I do want to thank all of you for being here. It's a community-wide issue, and we will go forward together with as much frankness as we can, so that we can, first of all, understand what we're dealing with and how we can do a more effective job with the limited resources that we all have. So the minutes or the record of the hearing will remain open for another week. So any community persons, any legislators, anyone who wants to submit further testimony or statements to the committee can do so in 1 week. And with that, I thank all of you and adjourn this hearing.
Thank you.